Hi everybody, hope everybody's staying healthy and well. Today I'm going to give you 10 different things to think about in portrait photography to help create better images of your family while you are quarantining. I already have a video on white balance, so if you haven't already watched that, or if you're not already familiar with it, go over there and watch the discussion on white balance. But with respect to portraiture, if your white balance is off, then your skin tone will be off, and that is very important with portraits. So when I took this photo, this was taken quite a long time ago, 2018, not that long ago, but this was actually a test shot. That was my first shot from a setup, and it is a very, very poorly set up shot in terms of my camera. The white balance, it's obviously way too warm, and so I needed to cool it down, and so I made some adjustments, also brought the exposure up, and this is where I ended up. That makes the skin tone much, much more appealing and more realistic. Number 2 is to create a portrait brush. So I have a portrait brush, and I actually have a couple of different iterations of it that actually is designed to bring up the exposure, but then also maybe to lift the shadows a little bit, maybe to increase sharpness a little bit, and I can brush it over portrait subjects. And when I applied that to her, that is the change. So you can see without it and with it, it just doesn't completely change the image, but it just draws attention into the subject a bit more. And that brush, you can just create it and save it as a preset in Lightroom and then use it over top of your people. The next thing is to develop the ability to retouch skin. So even people that have absolutely lovely skin can have little blemishes and marks. And so if you look on retouch, it's just, little tiny blemishes. And so when you retouch skin, you can take that away. Now you can see that in the skin here, it's still very much skin. You can see pores and you can see all the texture. One of the mistakes people make in editing skin is they go too far. They take away the essence of what makes it look like skin. And so I take out blemishes, I'll take out any pimples or flecks of makeup that are underneath the eye that fell off of an eyelash or anything like that. But I don't take off permanent markings, like if somebody has a beauty mark or something like that, as a general rule. The tool that I use, I do this in Photoshop, and I use a plugin, and it's called Chef's Delicious Skin 4. It's a fantastic little plugin. It's only, I believe it's $49 or $59. It's not real expensive, and I have a discount code for that because I always show it in my Lightroom classes and Photoshop classes, and it's just Mark, M-A-R-K, 25 for 25% off any of their products. But Chef's Delicious Skin is fantastic. Alright, so the next thing I want to talk about is cropping and headroom. Alright, so headroom, let me zoom back out here, is the amount of space between the top of somebody's head and the top of the frame. And if you have too much space up here that isn't necessary, it weakens your composition. So simply by cropping some of that in, you get a much stronger portrait. Now, you don't even need the very top of somebody's head. If you take a look at fashion magazines and look at a ton of portraiture, you will see a lot of fantastic images that actually don't include the very top of the head. In my shooting, I do tend to include the top of the head most of the time, but a lot of photographers don't, and that is not a bad thing. Alright, so the next thing that I'm going to talk about very quickly is framing. So framing is the concept of having some sort of a structure that creates a frame within your picture frame. And obviously this is a couple of girls that are celebrating their graduation, and this gazebo created a frame that just naturally framed them, and that illustrates framing just as clearly as you can illustrate it. The next thing I want to talk about is transecting somebody's head. Now this is an unedited photo because this was put into my trash pile right away. First of all, and I don't have this as one of my 10s, so this is the freebie 11th, but if you're going to cut off a foot, you want to cut off the whole foot. So I would actually crop that up. So if you're going to crop and take out body parts, take it out on one of the longer sections of a limb, so halfway through a leg or halfway through an arm, but don't take off halfway through a hand or a foot, and it will look a little less stark that you have cropped off part of somebody's body. The actual reason why I went to this one next is that this line is going right through the middle of her head, and just by repositioning myself a tiny little bit, getting just a little bit lower and angling up, I put her head in amongst the trees, and this line is no longer coming through her ears, and that is a much, much stronger composition. And then I did edit this and put a portrait brush on that to bring her out a bit. And then the other thing that I did was I went into Photoshop, and I spent only about 2 minutes, but I got rid of a lot of these distracting elements. For anybody who's familiar with New York City and Central Park, this is the sailboat pond. These white things that are back here are actually sailboats, and then there's tons of people in the park, and there's little, like, it looks like an orange cone or a something floating or whatever. There's a lot of distraction. So just by taking that out, you draw the attention into her, and you can see the subject very clearly, and it just makes it a whole lot more pleasing to look at. The next one that I'm going to talk about is the idea if you're doing a family group or any grouping of multiple people, you want to try to avoid having their heads in a line. Try to put their heads in a triangle. There is just something compositionally about, and it always seems to happen when people naturally just sit down, if they're just sitting down to have a photo, they end up, their heads are all in a straight line. Now, it certainly doesn't hurt that Frank is totally like a head taller than his wife, so that really works well. And if that doesn't just naturally happen by the height of the people involved, then sometimes you need to kind of finagle things and work things around, but that really helps. Again, another little freebie. This is not part of my 10, but it's a real obvious element for me right here. These are wonderful leading lines that are leading right back into the family, and a lot of times you'll see pictures up against a brick wall or against windows like this or something, and if you've ever kind of wondered why, they do tend to create really nice leading lines into whatever subject you're looking at. Alright, so I'm going to scoot forward on my film strip here, and we're going to take a look at this one. So I wanted to take a real quick moment to talk about posing differences for men and women. So one of the things that is a pretty standard opinion about posing women is that you kind of want to try to avoid having the shoulders squared to the camera. If you see in these other photos of her, same person, within seconds of this photo, I just turned her so that one shoulder is away and the other is closer. And now I process these so they have a sun overlay. I chose that actually because it matches what's hitting her hair, and it looks like it's there, but it's not. That is just Photoshop. But just by moving the shoulders so that they're not squared to the camera, it makes a huge difference. And the same thing if we're looking in closer to, closer crop of the head, just by having the shoulders not square, you just get a very flattering, a nice pose. The next thing that I want to talk about is if you have two of anything, it makes the pose more interesting if they're not at the same height, right? So in this case, by the shoulder, this one is lower than the other, and so it makes it compositionally more interesting than if they were on exactly the same height in the frame. Same thing with hands, maybe one hand higher than the other, arms, legs, whatever is in the photo. You just want to have them variety to create difference. All right, and the very last thing that we're going to talk about is when you're taking photos of family members. One of the things that really helps a photo is when there is a closeness amongst family members. So even though this is a nice scene, although little dude here looks like he's had better moments with his facial expression, but they're out in a pumpkin patch in a wagon, and it has a lot of potential. But Dad isn't totally connected in with the boys on this one, and so I just had him squat down. And here again, we kind of get back to a triangle shape with the heads, which doesn't hurt at all, and just the family closeness of having them tied in. We also got rid of all this distracting stuff, the tractor for the hayride, and whatever that is, I'm not sure. It just got to a much more plain and simple look, which I think does a great job. And actually, these aren't on the list either, but I see an easy one here again, the transecting of the head by moving and getting lower and shooting up at a bigger angle, at a different angle. I was able to put their whole upper bodies easily within the frame of these trees, as opposed to having the blown out water, and so it's just much stronger image approaching it from that way. Here again, we have the triangle thing that I had mentioned, and just for the very last one, we'll talk a little bit about cropping. So this actually came straight out of the camera looking like this. And it's a little bit limiting because I'm shooting in Verizon Hall with the Philadelphia Orchestra, and so you can't use any kind of flash. You cannot use any supplemental lighting at all. So you basically have to get what you can get and then edit later. So because of the stage lights and because of how much red is basically going on, I got rid of quite a bit of the red and just kind of got so that the skin tone was back to looking more natural, and I cropped in a ton. Actually, without the crop, you can see these folks here with the burgundy and the red tops. To me, that just really created a visual distraction, so I kind of wanted them out of there. And then a pretty substantial vignette. There was actually a lot of digital noise in this. It's shot at 6400 ISO, but it's on an A7R4, and it does tend to get a little noisy. I can actually pull the shadows up and let you see there's a fair amount of noise going on back in there. So the simple thing on this image was just to pull that down. It actually kind of gets rid of the distracting element of the wood grain back there anyway, and isolates our subject, and then with her facial expression looking over at the violins, it makes for a really neat image. I toyed around with taking the microphone off and just photoshopping it out. There's a fairly problematic area in here because of the way the light is behaving and that piece of tape and whatnot. So I did not actually go and complete that. I worked on it a bit. This part was easy to take out, but the tape, so then she ended up with a piece of tape on the side of her head. So I just left it at that, and that was what was going on in real life anyway. So I hope all of these are good suggestions and things that you can take and apply to the photos you're getting of your family while we're all still quarantining, and take care of each other and stay distant and keep going. Hopefully things will start turning around here in a little bit, but we've gotta still do our part and stay isolated. So be happy and be well and shoot some photos. Bye-bye.